notes. Okay.
If you want to get back to that other screen, you can push escape if you prefer that view.
Thank you. Can you see the slideshow now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Today I'm going to talk to you about getting started with silvopastures. So what is that exactly? What is it different than the rotational grazing that you've just been hearing about? So it's a managed land use to produce both forage and timber or tree crops. What is it not? It's not putting livestock out in the trees, leaving them there until they have eaten all the forage, trampled all your seedlings, and browsed all your young trees. That's not a good idea. So my name is Tess Hahn. I'm keeper of the sheep at Blacktail Farm. We have a little over 100 acres in North Idaho, halfway between Coeur d'Alene and Sandpoint. About 60 of it is managed as a sheep farm, and all of it is managed for timber production. I'm a participant in the Master Forest Stewardship program, and I also lead the veterinary science programs for 4-H locally. Here are some pictures of some of the residents up there. So silvopasture can describe a variety of land uses. It might be uniformly spaced trees with grazing in between, like an apple orchard. It might be windbreaks. It might be fields converted to forests. It might be edges of pastures. It can be a variety of things. Today, my goal is to acquaint you with some of the factors that you'll want to consider when you decide how to design your own system. I'll tell you a little bit of background about silvopasture and then the how to do it practicalities. So why did farmers create open fields in the first place? And why do foresters care about canopy coverage? Because photosynthesis, of course, is the key to life on Earth. So if every acre of your land is a solar collector, we want to make good use of the sunlight that falls on that land. So you want to maximize the grass production and harvest it efficiently with ruminants. Grazing properly will improve the habitat for the wildlife. So to maximize the solar collector leaves on your foliage, you want to leave 50%, just like Samantha was talking about, and you saw the slides that she showed, showing that the roots will benefit from you leaving 50%. And in terms of forestry, you want to make sunlight available to the best trees by removing the competition. So silvopasture is good for you and also the planet. Besides giving multiple layers of production that can even out your return, it's also the highest amount of carbon sequestration of any ag system. And I wondered, how is that so? Trees create an upper layer storage of the carbon in the wood together with an underground storage in the roots. And you can read more about that in a book called Drawdown by Paul Hahn. Cornell University studied the uses and challenges of silvopasture, and you can read about that in the book called Silvopasture by Steve Gabriel. So one of the things that they talked about was the challenges of silvopasture. Fencing, establishing fences, managing the time requirements, and so forth. The lack of knowledge about forage quality, and that's, of course, very common with all of us. A lack of supportive information from agricultural extension offices, but we're benefiting from this particular presentation and from that of Rebecca and Samantha. So to succeed with silvopasture, what do you need to do? Consider the sunlight needs of the forage and the trees. Match the animals to the land type and to the stage of succession. And very importantly, move animals in rotation according to the regrowth of the vegetation keeping them off long enough for it to regrow. Matching the trees to the site and encouraging a diversified plant community that's appropriate to that habitat. And then for your own benefit, stack the management to save yourself time and effort. So where do we go from here? Let's get started on my unique situation. So this is Tess's how to do it. First of all, start with a forest stand map and plan. The trees are less mobile than the animals, so you need to learn, think about which trees you're going to keep and which ones you're going to get rid of. So here's thinning. This is the before and this is the after. The hydrology, slope, and soils will create a habitat, so you consider what trees are going to flourish there. Also consider the access to the site and the access in different seasons. So here's an overview map of the sheep farm. This is high ground and low ground. Up here are trees that are not bothered because they're going to be the watershed for the ponds and the streams and the wells that go down through here and all the way down to the low spot and join with the year-round creek. So the blue areas are the tree management areas, the forestry management, and the red areas are the grazing management. And this is neither because it is watershed. So we're not disturbing these trees. And the access road coming in, the access roads for the forestry set a pattern of how we're going to move animals as well. So you first of all establish a plan for land use that makes sense for your trees. Then the next step is assess the various grazing areas. So you can sort of informally score each pasture area based on its sun and its moisture and its soil and so forth. Maybe the soil is very poor and dried and you have mostly weeds. Maybe you need to use the sunnier areas first. So when you're doing that, what you can do is to make a preliminary plan. So here's that watershed area. Here are grazing areas. This is all deep forest, and this is silvopasture area. So what are those numbers? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in each place. That is the note of how quickly the grass regrows in each area. That is really, really important because the next thing you're going to do is make a grazing plan. And that's the sequence and duration of your rotation. And it's based on the regrowth interval. So back here, you'll see this big pasture here. We're going to take a closer look at that later. But you'll see that there are numbers that show how quickly it regrows. So you do your sequence based on the rotation that follows from the regrowth pattern. So here's an overview. Now this is a confusing looking slide, I'm sure. But here again is the watershed preserve. Here is the deep forest and the silvopasture areas. And here is that big pasture that's the main grazing. Let's take a closer look at that. You'll notice again the sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The perimeter fence is indicated by a solid road. We made access, there's a property line and then some trees and then road and then the actual pasture fence. That way we have access all the way around and we can take trees out with no problem. We can also move stock there, but what we do is we move the stock through these paddocks that are made by electronet fencing, and we move them in the sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why would it be like that instead of a checkerboard? Because, as you can see, so obviously from my art, this is where the stream goes from the ponds and it goes down to another pond and out. So those areas are moister, so they regrow faster than this high dry area up here. So we're going to start our grazing in this particular paddock, in this particular unit. We're going to start with 1, 2, 3, and move the electric fence as indicated by the dotted line, and move it to those general areas in that sequence. So what happens when we get around here? We've spent about a day or day and a half of each of those little paddocks. So maybe number 1's not ready yet. That's when the silvopasture comes into play. So we come out and we go into the other areas, such as out here, and we allow this to regrow and then come back again when the grass is sufficient. So you'll notice too the roads, the access, and so forth. It's very important to make your roads and alleys make it easy for the fencing and gates. So you're going to think about not only logging trucks, but also hay trucks, but also farm equipment and so forth. Be sure to put your gates on high ground to avoid muddy messes. Here's an example of a diagonal road and then a high dry gate. So first of all, we identify the trees we want to keep. You can consider leaving those trees a little bit denser at first, and then in a second pass, you can weed them out. A forester will tell you all about the diameter of breast height being ideal at about 40 to 60. That shows the density. So here's an example of an area that was grazed before, and so the density is less. And then this is newer silvopasture area where the density is still sort of high, but after a season of wind and weather and so forth, then we'll take out the trees that don't look like they're going to survive. So that spacing is very important. We want to leave enough spacing in the canopy so that the trees can flourish and also the grass can come in. This is an example over here of how the safe yard, or as Samantha said, sacrificial yard, but the sheep don't like it when I say that word. So this is the safe yard where they can be safe, I can feed them, and this grass can be safe and grow as it needs to before I put them on it. So here's the grass growing, getting its length, and then finally we only put them on it when there's an excess to eat, so that when they eat 50%, they can leave 50%. So by doing that, you can really make results. There was a question earlier about what to do with the junk. Well, I think this is a good picture of the junk. We've got a good stand of knapweed here. This is the native soil, or what was there before. And this is after 1 year, only 1 year of grazing properly with sheep. It's not lush pasture, but it looks a lot better and the weeds are gone. And it's a matter of no seeds were sown. This is just improving what's there, partly because they are very good at sheet composting, walking along and giving nitrogen deposits everywhere. So with doing that, we want to make use of the silvopastures because they take the pressure off the pastures that are trying to regrow, and they can provide some forage when it is needed. So let's summarize what we've got so far. We start with the plan for the trees, then we assess the regrowth interval that's needed for each various grazing area. And so then you can make your grazing plan in sequence based on the regrowth interval. You create fenced grazing units. You can use that with perimeter fencing of woven wire, and then you can use electric fencing for the middle, for the inner fencing. You can rotate the stock through them on a time schedule that allows the recovery and regrowth of the forage. So in my situation, I've found that 1 to 2 days, no more than 2 days on a plot, really works the best. It gets the mob in there, and then they eat, and then you move them off. I use the silvopastures strategically to complement and facilitate the rotational grazing. So it provides additional places for them to graze supplementally at the key times. So what happens when people say, oh, I bought some forest land, but I want to run animals on it. I want to turn that forest land into pasture or into prairie, basically. Well, don't underestimate the length of time and money that it's going to take for you to convert it. The microbes have to change. There's a lot that has to happen if you're going to do that. You can read about it in a book by Chris Mazer, but it's usually better to do what you want. I wanted to make a little note about water. This is the pina colada wagon. That's a wagon pulled behind an ATV with a water tank and a trough, and that allows me to keep the stock well watered in each of the pastures, because you don't want them to be more than 600 feet from water. So as you're buying things, make sure you buy a good livestock guardian dog, because if you're grazing out in the woods, you will need to have some protection. Another means of protection can be a donkey, because some donkeys do very well at chasing dogs and coyotes, and the sheep oftentimes tell the donkey their problems, and he helps them be protected from predators. When you're learning about grasses and forages, you can save yourself some trouble by thinking about it as a typical grazing calendar for your site. So what comes in when, if you think about it over time, because the same thing that's happening in the spring is not going to be happening in August. And about forages, some of the forages do double duty, because as more legumes come up, the tannins in the forages can help reduce bloat. So there are several high tannage forages that are a benefit if you can include them. And what about weeds? Well, study up on your favorite weed and how to control them with grazing. This is in the bibliography, this livestock grazing guidelines, and it tells you each weed and what the way to get rid of that weed is. And there's also a targeted grazing handbook that is by the University of Idaho that is wonderful. It's got the principles, it's got individual topics. It's very worthwhile getting. So some good materials exist to help you learn how to get rid of the weeds with targeted grazing. And in autumn, or the times when you're not grazing, be sure that you add your organic material in the form of the fines of the hay and also of the mobile manure spreaders, because every bit of organic material that you put out on your soil instead of in your barnyard is stuff that you don't have to move. And the sort of sheet composting, someone asked earlier about whether it should be composted first. If you have a sheet of compost, then the microbes and earthworms will break it down a lot faster than if it's in a pile that you have to move and move and move and move. So here are some of the landscaping crew at Blacktail Farm. If you would like to see more videos or more information, you can go to Blacktail Farm and look at the videos there. So that concludes what I've prepared. I wanted to make sure there will be time for question and answer. Do I have any questions?
That was great, Tess. Thank you so much. I don't see any questions at the moment, but we can give it a minute to let some things come in. So just a reminder to our attendees, you can type your questions in the Q&A box, or you can also type them in the chat. I do see one question, Tess. Janelle asks, where is the booklet on livestock grazing found?
So there are two that I mentioned, and one of them is called Targeted Grazing Handbook, and that is available from the University of Idaho. You can download the complete handbook from the University of Idaho site, and you can also get a printed copy of that handbook from the American sheep industry. And I believe that those are in the bibliography, and if it is not so, then we can add it. And the contact for that is the range ecologist at the University of Idaho. Her name is Dr. Karen Launchbaugh, Launchbaugh. The other one is from Oregon, and that is
well, we can make sure that
right
the
here, Livestock Grazing Guidelines.
Great.
That's also available. I know I put it on the bibliography. The difference is that the one on the right, this Livestock Grazing Guidelines, that's specifically for noxious weeds. So that's they're slightly different, and they're both very valuable.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a couple more questions. Carly asked, have you had problems with donkeys foundering like another participant mentioned? What is that and how do you deal with it? And also, do guard donkeys have to be trained as such?
I believe they do have to be trained as such. I am quite lucky because George was a Bureau of Land Management donkey that was considered worthless because all he did was chase dogs. And so I gave him a trial with a few little ram lambs, and he liked them and they liked him, and so it was a process. He's never hurt any of the sheep. He's very good to the sheep, but I know that donkeys can be a little rough on the sheep. I don't leave him in when the girls are pregnant. I don't want them to be jostled. And then the other part of that question, so the
was
training,
about the donkeys foundering.
oh, the foundering. He's never foundered, but I don't have that rich and lush, as you can see from this photo, I don't have beautiful lush alfalfa pastures.
Could you explain a little bit what foundering means?
It's a bit like if I'm a diabetic and I eat a box of See's candy, it's just too much all at once. The body can't handle it. So what happens is that the growth, the hoof becomes very, very swollen, kind of like if you have too high a blood sugar almost. All right, so it becomes impossible for the blood to flow correctly there, and the animal becomes lame in all four feet. It's a very miserable situation for them, and the only thing to do is to go on a reduction, to reduce the amount of lush vegetation that they use. So they would go on a very poor quality diet, not poor quality, but not alfalfa certainly, because it's just too rich for them.
Okay.
I think it's about protein levels in the feed. So a feed that has less protein in it would help a foundered animal.
Thank you. Yeah.
And
I,
also,
I should be able to explain that a little better, huh? But
it
Oh, I
has,
thought you did great.
isn't there, I had a donkey that had problems like that all the time, and he was a natural guard for the sheep because he would chase things off. But he foundered so easily, and if you weren't careful, he would get into the sheep feed, and he had to be dry lotted. So basically put on ground that had no pasture at all at certain times. And when he foundered, when he like got into sheep feed or something, his hooves would just be a mess. So it has something to do with that. And I wish I could explain it better as well. But that was back in the Palouse where we had very lush grass.
yeah, I'm fortunate that I don't have that lush of grass that would cause George to founder. But on the other hand, if that occurs, what you do for that animal is to hose with cold water, hose those feet, and that will help a lot of bring down the inflammation, because there's such a inflammation there at the growth margin of the feet, of the hooves, and you'll need to reduce that, and also talk to your veterinarian, get some anti-inflammatory action on board with them.
Great. That's awesome. We do have another question from Janelle. She asks, do you need more than one guard dog together? It seems like it could be dangerous to leave in the field if you have multiple coyotes to deal with, and she would be worried about the guard dog. Is that a problem you experience?
Yes, it is, Janelle. You're absolutely right. I have a 10-month-old guard dog that you may hear in the background, and she thinks she can take on 4 coyotes with no problem, but I fear for her. And with the sheep, I generally have 2 dogs, because that way one can't come and the coyotes can't come around and get her from behind. Typically what happens is one of the guard dogs will stay right close to the sheep and keep them in a bunch, and the other one will go out and be the attacker for the coyotes. So if you don't have at least 2, your sheep don't know what to do when everything starts getting crazy. And also we have other predators here. We have cougars, and that makes a big difference too. You don't want one single dog. It's a good question.
Can I speak to that as well?
Sure.
I had incredible coyote pressure on my sheep farm, and it was a long, winding pasture that I could not easily see the ends of it. So the only thing that worked after trying the donkey, which wasn't as good as I needed, he didn't care that much about the sheep. I tried a llama. The only thing that worked was the Pyrenees. And what we did that was so successful and wonderful was we would have a trained one, an older one, and then a younger one. And we'd always overlap it so that the older one would train the younger one. And sometimes we'd get 2 pups because they tend to be pretty rambunctious, and then they've got somebody to play with. And it does end up being, a lot of dog food bill, which maybe wasn't really, it ended up being about the same cost-wise, but the peace of mind and not having to pick up dead, chewed animals, there's just, and I love the Pyrenees, so that solution was fantastic. But we did have to put a scare wire, an electric scare wire, inside our entire paddock, because they do like to get out, and that combination was perfect, and we had a huge amount of coyote pressure. There's also a really good bulletin from Oregon State University. It's older now, but it was on how to train your livestock guardian dog. You can find it with a Google, I'm sure.
Yeah, you make a good point about overlapping an older dog with a younger dog, and also having some males and some one male and some females. That seems to help as well.
Awesome.
Okay, there are some things in the chat. Let's see. Do you see any, Mackenzie? There was some more talk about manure spreaders. I'm not sure if there's any more. There's no more specific questions for Tess, I don't believe.
I don't think so. Did we address what animals would be best for cohabitating? Brad asked about that for homesteading purposes.
We did discuss that, and
Awesome.
maybe Tess has some more to add on that topic. I don't know.
I have used all of them together except for cattle. We've had horses and llamas and sheep and llamas and donkeys and, you know, all the different ones. What seems to work well, and I'm sorry, Janelle, no, I haven't had pigs, but I like pork. So what I have seen you worked very well is that the pigs come in and root up and sort of destroy the ground a little bit, you know, churn it up, and then the next year it's fabulous for pasture, but not in the same year. I've seen that with some of my friends who've run pigs first, and then the next year sheep, and then after that, boy, everything goes, because it's with the sheep spreading their small manure everywhere and doing a good job. That works really well. The llamas typically are best as an alert system. If I only had one dog, I would always try to make sure I had a llama too, because more sheep are probably lost to attacks by domestic dogs that get into the field in a lot of small holdings especially, and a llama will be a sort of more alerting about an invading dog. And also they're up tall, and they can alert and let your dog know or your sheep know that something is around. So when you're mixing, they're not so much a predator control as in attacking the coyotes, but they will let everyone know.
Diane asked, oh, sorry, was there something else to add?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Diane asked, what about adding trees to a grass-only pasture, both for firewood and also for shade for the animals? Do you have any advice about that? How far apart should they be planted so that the grass can still grow?
Yeah, that's a good point. Because really with silvopasture, you've got two different possibilities. Either you've got trees and you're going to add grass, or the other way around. And it does make a big difference. So there's a breakover point at about 300 trees per acre, where if you have more than 300 trees per acre, you're not going to really have very much grass. As far as for adding them, I would say consider doing rows. In the bibliography, there's a reference to, I believe it's Missouri, the agroforestry department in the University of Missouri, and they have got a lot of information that's useful about putting in rows of trees, in their case pecans and things like that, and also hickory and hardwood trees. And your fencing is easier, your shade is more available. You know, you make sure that your trees are going to shade the areas that you want shaded. And so it is possible to do that, but you'll need to make a plan to make sure that you don't get too many in a row, not more than 300 in an acre, and preferably in sort of rows of trees or staggered rows of trees, so that you can move your fences more easily. I hope that answers your question, Diane.
Tess, you mind if I toss in on that a little bit?
Go ahead.
If you're planting trees in a pasture, I would try to keep the livestock out of that area the first couple of years. depending on the intensity of the livestock somewhat, but cattle will tend to trample tree seedlings. Goats or sheep, depending on the seedling species, may decide to munch on them. Once they're, shoulder height trees, the livestock will pretty much walk around them. But the other issue is, in terms of establishment, grass is a very effective competitor for moisture. And so having at least a 3-foot circle without any competing vegetation, whether you do it, culturally or through a herbicide of some kind, is really critical to establishing those trees as well.
Yeah, you make a really good point, Chris. And if you have a llama, be careful because they will eat your trees even worse than sheep.
So,
And
there,
too, donkeys will eat your trees.
and there are some trees that that may have toxicity for some livestock. So, Chris, you're muted.
yeah, pines can cause abortions with cattle. Usually cattle don't munch on the trees too. The only cases that I'm aware of where you've had that happening, pine needle abortions are discussed quite a little bit, but the only cases that I'm aware of where it's documented that actually happened is where cattle were fed hay over the winter under trees, and there was a base of needles, and they kind of overcame their distaste for pine needles. With light cattle anyway, it's rare that they munch the trees. The damage is usually from trampling.
I was thinking about we have horses, and I know that's not we weren't talking a lot about horses today, but there's ornamental trees that are toxic to horses if they eat the leaves.
Oh, yeah, cherry in particular.
Yep, and walnut trees, black walnut trees, red maple trees. So a little research, because trees are expensive and so are livestock.
That's great advice.
So Kimberly asks a question about sheep that are a bit slender, less than she wants. Well, I mean, I'm a real big believer in not very much grain. You would want to have a little bit higher protein hay, something perhaps a sandfoin or a alfalfa, something like that. And the best information that I've ever seen about nutrition for animals, for sheep, is from the book From the Feed Trough by Woody Lane, PhD. It's on our bibliography. And he goes into what's going on in the ruminants' guts and how the different kinds of feed affect them. Something that you can also consider is to do something like pea pellets or alfalfa pellets or grass pellets, just to make sure that there's no waste going on. But Kate, you've raised sheep and you did a lot of graining of your sheep, didn't you?
We just used pea. We used pea screenings. They're pelleted peas.
Yeah, that's great.
We had a really good grass pasture, sub-irrigated, and so we grass fed them. But we fed them peas and hay in the winter, and the peas were just our go-to, really good source, and they were locally available in totes, so very reasonable. They're like 14% protein, I think.
Yeah, that really keeps the weight on them, and it doesn't change their guts in the way that grain will do.
So I do believe you can get them from Spokane Seed, pelleted peas.
Yeah, it's about $200 for a pickup truck load.
Yeah, not everybody's from everywhere, so I don't know. Not everyone, but it's a good thing to check out. It is really good for sheep, lamb.
That's great. Thank you so much. Are we ready to move into our Q&A and our panel?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Mackenzie. Unless you have anything more, any final words on Silvopasture, Tess?
Well, I'm curious, because we are all over the state, in my situation, I have a conifer forest and I'm putting sheep in a conifer forest that's already established. I'm not trying to grow seedlings in there, but I'm curious to see if there are very many people who are wanting to take an area and start tree crops or forest, or if it's more a matter of using. I don't know if we can have some sort of a feedback from all the participants, because I didn't know if, how much should I have included about, orchards and things of that sort.
Oh, that's a good question. And I might have had that at the beginning in terms of interest in orchards, but I didn't double check that. But that I think is a good thing to maybe just say a few words on, because that's a great dual use of your land.
Yeah. We could have folks type in the chat if they want to share a little bit about what they're focusing on for their land.